One of the biggest things that affects our children today when you ask them is that, there's a WhatsApp group and I'm not a part of it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That is a form of exclusion, and it's very simply a way of saying that I have the power to not let you in.
It's a lovely. No, I'm going to start again. They couldn't even come with a better name.
Which school did you study in?
Clooney Convent.
So, which school?
Clooney Convent. That is where हमारा हिंदी बहुत ही निपुण है started.
Oh, yeah.
The law, entomology.
Ethology.
I will never get this right. Will you edit this?
No.
I've also been called 11 steps planning for everything.
Who called you that?
I've been a big fan of yours for, I think, from when you started.
Really, I was terrible. You can't be my fan.
I'll throw a question back at you, Sajid.
Oh, yo.
He had such a thick Malayali accent that even the Malayalis didn't know what he was talking about.
ये थोड़ा और बेहतर हो सकता था. You know to yourself.
Behtar is what?
I shouldn't venture into controversial areas.
No, get it.
No.
They call me Gawar. I'd like to come back to this podcast when we made it. Because I'm coming from a rural background, only thing I know, I can hold a pencil.
That was hard. Again, I've cried like a baby after my first divorce.
In between, Met Gala happened, Cannes happened, and this is where I am. I felt that there was too much noise, I call it, in the world. There was a lot of noise,
I'm not trying to fit into your world. I'm trying to create a world of my own.
So how would you define who am I? Hi, welcome back to another episode of Attitude Makeover. In the last 50 plus episodes that I've been having these conversations about personal transformation and a reboot journey, one thing that really stuck out is, everybody has a journey. Everybody goes through the ebbs and flows. And through these struggles that one goes through, the last thing one would want is to really be shamed for being human. There's a lot of conversation out there about mental health. My guest today is Devi, who has been immersed in this space for the last few years. And we're going to talk about a whole lot of things, whether it is women entrepreneurs and mental health. Is there some differences that we experience? What happens to the men in India? What do they really go through from a mental health perspective? We'll dig deeper into that with Devi. Devi, welcome on board, and thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you again, and I'm so happy you decided to have me over.
So Devi, I always start the conversation with the idea of having my guests get to know you on a personal front, because then there's a relativity to the conversation and why you are talking about this. So as we start, I think one thing I wanted to ask is, what's your journey been like? You've been in the corporate world for a couple of decades, and then you plunged into the entrepreneurial journey, and more specifically into the mental health space. But if you can really talk about your early years to what's the value you've grown up with, and also bring it down to what are your passions. And if I strip off all the titles, who is Devi?
Sure, I think that's a very interesting question. So if I was to kind of focus on the couple of things that you spoke about, saying what are the values, and that's a very personal and a very important part for me. I always talk about the fact that we all come with certain levels of values and beliefs, and it kind of drives the decisions we make in our lives. So I grew up in a small town called Vellore. Vellore is, even though I'm basically not from Vellore, Vellore is home. And the school that I grew up in is associated with Christian Medical College. So I grew up with a sense of charity, because that's something that is very deeply imbibed in us at the school. CMC itself is a charitable hospital, so you kind of grow up with very basic philosophy, which I think my 10th grade teacher summed up in one sentence when she found me goofing off. When she said, "Devi, you've been given so much and you consume so much. When do you think you'd like to start giving back?" I didn't do anything with it, but I think that's perhaps a very basic thought process that's always staying with me. And through my corporate career, it was a standard ladder, GE, IBM, HP, all organizations that only served to kind of strengthen some of these beliefs that I had. And I had I had the chance in 2018, after the whole HPE, HPI split, in terms of saying, do I go on and continue this in another organization, or will I now step out to see what else I can do? So not too many conversations. I think one short drive with my husband, and he said, if you want to jump, any time is a good time, but you have the opportunity now, so why won't you do it? So I did, and mental health is a place or a space that I really, really think is extremely underexplored. And I'm not going to say in India or the West or whatever, right? It's just underexplored. I think there is a very surface level awareness of it. There's definitely a lot of work that's happening behind it. But then to go ahead and say this theoretical work, how will I apply it to great effectiveness to each of us? I think that's where there's a huge gap. And I started with children. Because of the fact that I think as adults, we kind of know that we're going through certain issues. We're able to identify our dysregulations. We're able to identify what kind of sets us off. And therefore, I think as an age group, we're in a far better place to ask for help, seek help, and perhaps also receive help. Children, however, are going through such a hugely transitional phase that oftentimes, they don't know themselves, so they're not able to speak about it. And I think also children's mental health is far more nascent in awareness and acceptance in a lot of countries than perhaps adult mental health spaces. And in India specifically, right? I mean, the number of times I've heard these are Western issues, when India alone has 10 million children being diagnosed with ADHD every year.
10 million.
10 million. And I mean, this is an India Today publication. I'm not even pulling out Lancet or anything like that. This is a local publication which is very Indian, which is saying that it's 10 million every year. Which also means that on an average, we have 20 million adults who don't know how to handle this, right? When it comes to passion, I think what I'm very committed to is, from a professional perspective, of course, is definitely impacting a million lives, right? Positively impacting a million lives is perhaps a very simple vision statement we have, and that's something that I'm very committed to. I think on the personal front, and I know we'll speak about this a lot more, passions there's just so many. I don't know, sometimes it just becomes a mix between passion and duty, and you have to do this sort of thing. But yeah, I think I create a bit of a manifesto every year.
Oh, you do?
I do all these very banal things like creating annual manifestos, but yeah, but I think one thing that I'm definitely working on very specifically is to personally is to definitely break out of making this a very lonely journey. I think the first 3-4 years I was consumed by what I was doing by myself, very inward looking. So in the last 4-5 months, I very consciously kind of stepped out of that space to say that I'm going to spend more time speaking to other people, not necessarily about work or home or children or anything like that, but just start having broader conversations.
There are 3 things that stood out over here. First of all, I'm very curious to know about the manifesto. I'd love to understand how you go about. Is it like an annual thing, so you go through a reflection of how you've done and thereby here's additional things, or how does that happen?
It is. So one of the big things that I started doing just a few months back is actually getting very active on LinkedIn. Until I started looking earlier this year of saying, how do I now increase reach and relevance, because of the fact that we also started bringing B2B into our business, right? We would otherwise have very clear direct to consumer business, but then we started saying we've got to do business to business, because we were realizing that our core focus area, which was children, are very deeply affected by the toxicity perhaps at a workplace culture. Yes. Perhaps the whole hybrid working or the remote working system is definitely affecting our children. So as we worked with parents, and that's something that we do, we work with the child and the parent, we sort of started seeing inroads there. And so when we started doing B2B, it kind of started, I started realizing that I need to reach out on a platform, and LinkedIn was perfect. So when I started reaching out to LinkedIn, I had to go back to look at a lot of my notes, and I journal. I don't journal like in the classic journaling way. I use a lot of post-its to write my stuff, and anytime I write something, I just take out those post-its and stick it in a notebook. And that's where I pick stuff out of. So to your question, is it a planned thing? It's not planned to the extent that I don't plan for some things to come out of the manifesto, but I do write my thoughts on a regular basis, very randomly, and I stick it in a book. So my manifesto comes out of there. I try not to make too many. So now I have a list, right? Because I've been doing this for about 7 or 8 years. So now I have a list that I keep pushing on with every year. So it's not like I've finished something. I still continue with it. Therefore, if I've been doing this for 8 years, come 2023, I'll have the 9th point in there. That's really how I work.
This is something similar to, I think it is GE, where we had this continue, start, and stop, right?
Yes.
So this is something similar. It's very lightweight, but you want to see what you want to continue forward.
Absolutely.
You want to see. It's a very interesting thing. As you were discussing this, I was like sort of reflecting on my own journey as an entrepreneur. When I started, I remember just writing small lines on Instagram about what my thoughts were.
Right.
To gradually, I chose Instagram because it's a very informal space. It's very forgiving. It's a lot of validation that people seek, but for me, it was like an experiment of, is this something I can sustain for a long time? And eventually, I then moved to LinkedIn because that's where my audience pool is also. But as I did that, the first year, I still remember when I put the business model, the canvas, I realized it's very aspirational, so I had to keep myself grounded. This exercise of what you want to start, continue, and stop really helps you also base your expectations to a very fair bit.
Right.
Right? And I think it's very important, whether you're an entrepreneur or a working professional, to sort of step back and look at it holistically and see, how does this pan out for yourself? When you talked about this manifesto, you talked about keeping in mind not just where you are from a business perspective, but also where each family member is.
Right.
But along with that comes the second bit of us as women and the responsibilities that we carry, whether it is elderly care or child care, being a mother, being a wife, being a daughter, and so on and so forth. And then your own individual self. It's a lot of things that you go through as an entrepreneur about yourself. How is it for you? How did you go through? And as you're in this space, are you seeing this more, as an experience out there, or is this just a number that is there as stats?
I think the first is, if you were to go back and start with your initial conversation in terms of saying, or your initial point in terms of saying that there's a push factor, right, where you need more time with your child, you need more time with the family. I think that's a bit of a misnomer, because being in the corporates is perhaps what gives you more structured time. You are able to actually bifurcate or compartmentalize the time you have within the day and say work and no work. I actually find that perhaps my work-life balance is far worse than it has ever been.
Are gone.
Yes, the boundaries are gone. The responsibility is yours. You are a brand. You don't have a couple of alphabets behind you that's propping you up. It doesn't open doors anymore, right? So you've got to work that much harder, and therefore I think it kind of it kind of just entirely depends on you and your individual passion, right? After some time, a push from somebody else in the family is also not going to work, because it's just going to tire you out. So if you're a sustained, consistent entrepreneur, it means you've got an itch, and you're going out all the way to do it. One of the things that I always tell friends of mine who might have had partners who are entrepreneurs is that when you're growing something like a company, like a plant or a tree, it's got to feed off something, and unfortunately it'll feed off a very healthy part of you, because it needs to do that to survive. It needs its nutrients. Oftentimes you'll find that it's actually family that takes the hit, right? So for me, I think I walked in very conscious about it. So a part of my manifesto still, I still ask myself, saying, what is the most important thing for me this year? And when I started, it was always marriage, being a mother, and then being an entrepreneur. Across the last few years, I told my husband, that's sort of changed. It's actually being a mother, being an entrepreneur, and my marriage has actually dropped to the bottom. And I think he was a little surprised that he wasn't happy at all. And I said, you know what, now I'm giving this to you. I said, you make marriage the top priority. You do what it takes to keep us going now. Because I've done that for, for so long. I think all of us in our 40s.
I'm actually getting goosebumps as you talk about this because it's so relatable,
yes,
every bit of it.
Because, and I don't begrudge that at all, right?
Yeah.
My marriage is so important to me. And it's perhaps not very fashionable, but it's incredibly important to me. It's a huge part of my identity and who I am. So, but I think what it's done for us is that it's helped us kind of rejig some of our working patterns, right? One thing that's definitely gone off the table is an expectation that food is going to be available at 8 p.m. sharp or 9 p.m. sharp, because I said, that's not something I can take care of. I'm going to make sure that our daughter eats earlier. I said, her food's always going to be available and ready because I'll take care of that, but ours is something that you will handle now. The amazing part is, being a strategy consultant, now we have a clean process around it. He's put down a process and we don't budge from that process until there's a certain amount of time that's passed and boredom is set in or whatever, right? And I love that because I needed that support. So I think in terms of, going back to the question that you asked, the multitasking that we're expected to do, is that something that I, started asking myself very consciously. And I think I needed to get over a little bit of perhaps guilt in terms of saying, well, it's not that marriage is not important, but I don't have the bandwidth to give it that level of importance anymore. It needed a very honest conversation with myself. I said, I'm not going to spend the money on it, because there was that huge pressure that I felt personally that I was actually depending on another person's money when I never have. I would actually, I think one of my most killing moments was when I had to get an add-on credit card. I think it killed me. It killed me when I had to tell my husband that I don't have a salary account anymore. And I think in some ways, these are some of the privileges that some of us come with,
Yes.
where you have a partner that says, that's okay. And, here's the add-on card. I said, well, I don't want, I don't want you to get a ping when I spend it. And he said, okay, we'll speak to HDFC and we'll figure out how you can do it. So we have 2 separate customer entries now. And I said, I will not be under scrutiny for swiping that card. I think we're very lucky that way that I have that level of comfort level. I mean, I have that comfort of doing that, but it was incredibly stressful for me to have these conversations. The second thing that happened was, my daughter, who was about 12 years old then, 12 to 13 years old then, she came and spoke to me and she said, listen, I don't want you to start off on your own. I've always been very focused on the fact that my daughter is going to be a pure feminist, right? She's going to be a strong girl. This thing. So the first book I bought her on feminism is a book called We Should All Be Feminists.
Oh my God.
Chimamanda.
You have to meet mine.
So I picked that up for her actually when she was, I think, about 10 years old. And she came and told me, she had that conversation with me. She said, you're going from independent to dependent. And I said, I agree, I am. And she actually asked me, saying, what sort of, she used the word power. She said, what powers will you give up now? I said, I don't know, will I have to? And it was a good conversation where I said, I don't know if you felt this was a power holding structure, and perhaps, it was something for me to reflect on, saying, were we 2 of these power pillars at home? Or was it just a responsibility situation that she saw as power holding? But I think I took away a couple of very important things from my conversation with my child, which is that number one, she was very worried about how the balance was going to shift at home. And I think it drove a bunch of thought processes for me. Was it essentially just her sense of being a feminist, or was she being very honest about the fact that she had some leeway with me which she didn't with her dad, and vice versa, right? So we had to sit down and tell her that, listen, nothing changes really. And I think one of the biggest things that my husband made very clear is that he said, our lifestyle does not change because your mother's not earning. Our relationship doesn't change because your mother's not earning, because she's just going to be earning a very different way. And I think that conversation was good for my daughter as well, because we spoke to her about how sometimes you don't have to be earning to call what you're doing a job,
Yeah.
right? It comes back to, is a homemaker therefore a job? Some of the jobs we do just don't have a steady income coming. It's just a building phase, or maybe the earning is in a different format.
Yeah. But it's a very interesting journey of how this can't be just a decision that you make. It has to involve every aspect of the home.
Yeah.
And take into consideration what are their fears.
Yes.
And what are their assumptions. And can you control any of that? Can you make changes to that?
Right.
And thereby, here's how we go. Do you think men go through these kind of things, or is it just women who go through?
Well, I guess most women, my experience of what men do is very closely knitted to men in my family and men who are very good friends. And I do not see a conversation like this happening. In fact, I think the other conversation I had to have very clearly with my husband was to say that I need a certain level of stability. And I told him, I said, for me to give up all of this and go, I unfortunately still need my creature comforts. Those are things that, I said, I'm 40 and I'm not willing to give up on that. That also included what he could do in his career. And we sort of said that, okay, the first couple of years we're not going to count because I'm just going to get my arms around things. But once business picks off, I said, for 5 years, you need to give me a no rocky platform. I don't believe that's a conversation, or that's perhaps a thought process that men instinctively have. But I'm finding that perhaps more men are willing to be a part of that conversation if one of us were to initiate it. I'm finding that it's maybe something that they're glad is happening because it's out there in the open. There isn't anything that's, an expectation sort of thing. You should have understood that this would happen, sort of pressure's not there. So I find that at least in the men I very closely interact with within family and close friends, I'm finding that they're very open to those conversations.
So I have a very curious question here, Devi. For someone who's listening to this conversation, who's probably not had these kind of conversations as a man in the house with the family, where do they start? Do they start by opening this as a conversation, or how do you go about it?
I think it takes a couple of steps back, Soujanya. This is something we spoke about in a men's, being a better dad. I didn't like the word better dad. Being a dad for today is something that we ran a session on with one of our corporate clients. And one of the things I said is, how many of us actually sit back, because the mums do it, all of us do it as mums, to sit back and say, 20 years from now, how do I see my child? How do I want my relationship with my child to be? It's a very conscious conversation that at least I know my friends and I have, because we know that, by the time we're in our 60s or whatever, right, we're not going to have a job keeping us going all the time. And the relationship with our child is going to be so fundamental. Perhaps the structure's shifted, right? It's two equal peers who are talking now. To say that, so therefore, what do I want that relationship to look like? Bring it down to very simple, tangible things, saying, would I like a call a day? Would I like a call every 3 days? Would I like a trip with my child once a year or twice a year? Would I like that? If I do, then I think it's time we started doing it now. You've got to sow the seeds now in small ways and start practicing a lot of that yourself as a parent, because you've got to start building that up very slowly. I would say for men, it's a great idea to have that conversation saying, what do I want of our relationship? Apart from, of course, the basics, right? That we're going to be together, we're going to be, in a comfortable place financially, we're going to be in a lovely house, the kids are settled, and then what? What does, two individual people, entities interacting with each other look like? If it is going to be one of not too much bitterness, of saying that I gave up so much for you and I got nothing out of it, because that is going to happen. I mean, as much as we don't want it to happen, that conversation is going to come up at some point of time if it hasn't already. Then it's a great idea to say, how do I kind of do a lot of self-reflection and say, how do I kind of balance that out? Yeah, and I think one of the things that I'd like to bring up here is, we speak a lot about mental health and, depression and all of that. I think the biggest true pandemic is loneliness. Yes. I think, fundamentally, with the way that social media has picked up and our interactions with each other are increasing, we are becoming more and more and more lonely people. Our way of thinking, our way of interactions is becoming more inward looking. And therefore, I think it's a great question for perhaps a man to ask as well. I think when it comes to masculinity, we've kind of always added the word toxic to it. But if you look at some of our biggest sources of strength, it's actually men. Yeah. My dad, my uncles to a certain extent, my husband, these are the people who, are always around, who are there to do the stuff that you cannot do. They're always around. And somehow that strength, because of whatever reasons, it's just gone through this whole transformation of saying no. Yeah. So oftentimes I actually speak to a bunch of mothers, and this is something that's on my mind all the time, saying, telling all our girls to be stronger and go for it. You can be anything that you want. And we're telling our boys, saying, be careful, you've got to be careful about the statements you make. Now, clearly, there's a lot of history behind this, right? There's so much of stuff that's happened, and there's got to be that balance. Don't get me wrong. So we are, again, as an organization, doing a lot to start looking at saying, what does it take to have a great male influence in a child's life? Yeah. Because I find that it's perhaps a place that, at least as a person who's working in a child's well-being space, it's a great idea to have a conversation. And my conversations have gone all which ways, right?
And it also probably requires one as parents to step back and look at how the world is changing. What's the world of the child today, and what does it look like another 20, 40 years from now? And are we preparing that child for that world?
I think we're seeing that in different places. I love I love your points. I think, Saujanya, we put in that deliberate thought process when it comes to a child's education. We put in an incredible amount of very deliberate and a lot of hard work into perhaps planning our finances so we kind of make sure that our children are well set. But the fact in terms of saying, what are we deliberating on, planning on, saying what will the child be as a human being, is just left on the side, because then we let the environment take over, or society, let the society take over, or just experiences take over, right? But the thing is that one of the things I tell a lot of people who come to us is that both parenting and relationships are actually very deliberate hard work. You've got to work at it. You've got to make it successful, like you make your career successful. To say that this is kind of grow on its own means that you're also admitting that it will grow any which way, right? And it doesn't have to, because to your question, maybe that's a great conversation for men to start having with their partners, perhaps with their parents too. I think that's I find that especially in especially in the age group that you're catering to, 35 45 or a little above, the extra role of being the provider for a parent has already started creeping in, right? At that point of time, I don't believe we're having open conversations of saying, what do you expect out of me, and this is what I can provide. How do we kind of fill the gap that there is, right? I don't think that's a conversation that's happening. So there's a lot of expectations that I see from parents who are, a good generation older than us. Our inability to reach up to those expectations, or the lucky few who are able to achieve it and more. And then you have another supplementary family, your other family, which is your wife and your child and all of that, where it's going to take a hit, because if you have an aged parent at home, we've kind of had unwell parents for a part of this year, and it does affect the rest of the house, right? To be able to therefore go back and say, well, you know what, we're having parents moving in, and this is what the changes are going to be. Having said that, what is important for you and what's important for you, if you still want to have your me time with your spouse, that you kind of lay those rules down or set those expectations down very clearly, saying this is what we're going to do.
So I honestly believe it's not fair on how we put all of this on a man.
I completely agree.
And I feel it's very important to step back and look at it as, what does it mean to be a man in today's world?
Yeah.
And it's not easy.
It's not. It is not at all easy. I must give you a personal anecdote. My husband's always been very good with gifts. My birthday gifts, etc. Always, it's always larger than life. It's like vacations to see, or a series of trips to see the art by a person that I like very much, or a series of visits to following the build-up of an architect that I like very much, etc. It's always been excellent. This year I got a Nike T-shirt, and I opened the bag and there's a Nike T-shirt in there, and I was like, oh, okay.
Third year happening.
And this is not even after like the early parts of marriage. It's like about a good 2+ decades of being together. And I love the fact that he said, listen, it's just too stressful, yeah. Thinking this up, it's just not my year today. And I love the fact that he said it, I think I felt rather guilty by saying, oh, it's just a Nike T-shirt sort of a thing. I was making a big deal out of it, but yeah. I'm sure it must be hell to sit and think of saying, now what will my wife like this year? I've done Caravaggio and I've done Jeffrey Bauer. Now what do I do this year? I think he just said, whatever the hell. She runs, I'll give her a Nike T-shirt and let's call it a day. That's fair. But you're right. There are a bunch of things that I see, right? One is, of course, the whole societal pressure. The other thing is that the whole, everybody's game is elevated and so has a man's. Everybody's doing more, right? There's more expectations out of you. And I think, at least for my father's generation, if you were a hardworking man whose, family was well kept, and you take that one vacation back to your mum's house and your, the grandparents' house and another vacation elsewhere, we were set, right? But now it's got to be cooler. You've got to plan for your child going abroad or wherever, right? It's got to be a fabulous thing. And I think in there, I noticed a trend, which is essentially that the average is not fun anymore. It's got to be a slightly superlative thing, right? You can't be just good enough. It's got to be a wow. And it's important to be wow because you've got to tell a bunch of people that it's wow. So to your question, I think it's a tough time and perhaps a far tougher time than we expect. Unfortunately, it also comes with the fact that they are living up to their own expectations of who they are as a man, having to prove that they're manly enough around the place. So I agree. I agree to have that conversation about saying, what do you need to be, and have that, we ask for equality. I think this is a place that they've got to be able to say, this is your part now. You handle this, and not just say that, your partner takes care of home and child. To start handing over some of those to the women around the place, and maybe also hand back some things to parents. But I think some level of, time and work time and material management, TNM has to happen here.
As great it is as a time for being a woman right now, it's also really one of the toughest times for a man right now.
It is.
So,
and I think there's also the labeling of what is a failure, right? I remember, I think it must have been about 20 odd years back when I was at GE, and something about, we were at a social thing, and somebody said, oh, he's just a loser. And it kind of struck me as a bit harsh because I know the person they were talking about, and he was struggling to complete a couple of projects. That was it. It was just a couple of projects. Stuff that I think with a little bit of help could have been completed very easily and resolved. But to define a person, a whole person, because of a couple of small misses, I think is perhaps something that's harsh on everybody. And here I'm not saying it's a man or a woman, but I do think that that whole definition, like you said, like the validation of the fact that everything has to be at a higher level, right? There's no more normality curve. There's not just the fact that the bunch of us are actually in the middle of it all. We're not, the loser end or the absolute high end winners. We're not the high stake rollers either. But being in the middle is actually stable. And then you have a bunch of things that are good and perhaps 3 times that much that are not good. And that's actually the ratio of how life runs. I don't think is being discussed very openly. I think there's a lot of expectations being set. I know there's a lot of expectations being set of girls as well. But I do believe that the whole history that we have of everything being dumped on the boy still continues to a very large extent.
What I also found is men don't even find themselves in that situation of, oh, I need to talk about this. I think it starts from, we are very comfortable. The moment we start hitting a problem, it's like, you know what, I need to talk. It's that easy for women.
Yeah.
But I think that's where it starts. Just the fact that you've hit that point where you probably need to seek help. And seeking help, whether it's about driving or anywhere,
Yeah.
any of that, seeking help is not a manly thing.
And perhaps
Correlation?
that's kind of, maybe therein we kind of relook at the word. Do we need to call it help? Maybe it's just a conversation, right? I mean, if I came to you and I said, Saujanya, you know, I'm sort of struggling with the, I don't know, Halloween costume, you'd never call it help. You'd call it a conversation, saying, oh, Devi just wanted to pick my brain. That's all you'd call it, right? You'd never say she came to me for help because she's a mother who doesn't have it all together.
It's a perspective.
It's absolutely what you call it, what you label it, and you're right, it's a perspective of what we look at.
Maybe it's more also than, I don't know, an awareness from the women that, oh, this is happening to the men, so let me step up here. And
So I think we're entering spaces that's going to get us a lot of feedback. I think women have been stepping up for the longest. Saujanya, we've stepped up, and we've stepped up how?
So I
right?
think at least opening these conversations,
It is-
let
it
me
is
step
important.
up and just open the doors for you to get comfortable with these conversations. I'm okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to be here to listen to you, to have this conversation.
I personally think women have stepped up and stepped up, right? We've done that a lot. Not to say that men haven't stepped up.
Yes.
But the fact is that, there's definitely an imbalance in there, right? And I think that kind of comes back to saying expectations and perspective. I think here are where we kind of do a role rebalance.
Yes.
I think the wars that we fought, Saujanya, you and I, to be able to work post having a child, to continue to work into oblivion, I don't know what we fought for, but to be able to wear the clothes we wanted, to marry the men we wanted, those were the, fights we all had. I think we've spoken a lot about the wars that women have gone to and won for the next generation. I think perhaps this is something that the men should start about, saying, let's have those conversations. Let's have those open conversations of saying, I'm feeling pressure when these things happen, right?
But here's the thing, right? For a man who is not used to having these kind of conversations, it takes a lot of gumption to come and say, hey, I want to talk. So when someone does that, then I think it's also required that we sort of give out a hand as women, rather than just, saying, oh, go figure out, because that's the norm. And I think that's where that balance of,
Humanness possibly comes in. If we
And-
were to take the gender out,
yes,
would it not be a very different
Yes,
look?
exactly.
And I agree with you, for everybody who's asked me, I've always said I'm always on the side of the woman, regardless, because I've always felt that, the whole, it's been a severe imbalance, right? Look at our women at work surveys that come out, etc., right? There is a clear bias, right? Now, couple of things that we perhaps need to realize is that it doesn't have, helping or having these conversations doesn't have to be a gender game. Like you said, it's just humane. We're humans, we're going to do well in some places, we're going to do worse off in 3 or 4 times as many places. There's got to be that help that we offer. And perhaps if we want to look at it truly as an equal partnership, saying you support me here and I support you there, is maybe where that conversation starts with.
I'm going to, in a lot of ways, it's not like a complete shift of gears, but it will interconnect. But I think one of the things we've talked about is in the space that you were working in, especially with children, and this is a space that I feel it's very important we start talking about, is the whole nuances of bullying they get. And children are like sponges. If your home space is the equation is not balanced, you're just going to absorb that. And you're going to carry that forward into your social space, which is your school, which is your friend circle, and so on and so forth. And so I've seen bullying to be of a different caliber these days. It's no longer just physical, it's no longer just a funny banter here and there. It's pretty mentally disturbing. Can you talk to us about what's really happening to children today from a bullying perspective?
Bullying is no different, right? It is somebody coming from a position of higher power or higher authority to get someone to do something that the other person does not want, do it against their wishes because the more powerful person is insisting that they do. Now, this could be something as simple as being physically, I wouldn't want to say abusive to start with, but just making the person physically uncomfortable, microaggressive behaviors, right? Passing these comments, very simply keeping you out of a WhatsApp group. One of the biggest things that affects our children today when you ask them is that, there's a WhatsApp group and I'm not a part of it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That is a form of exclusion, and it's very simply a way of saying that I have the power to not let you in. Right? So I think fundamentally, to your point, what is bullying? It's clearly somebody who's coming from a power of a stronger area to make somebody who's weaker do something that they don't want to make them feel a certain way. But it's definitely there to instill the power, the feeling of lack of power or position in that particular area. There are two parts to this, right? One is the fact that what we have seen in our experience is the fact that the child at home has experienced situations where they have felt powerless. It could be because they're being smacked at home. It could be because there's perhaps more violence at home. It doesn't have to even come down to violence. It could be because they're restricted at home. Oftentimes we find children who are said, no, you can't go to play, you can't have this, you can't have that, come out with a sense of irritability there, right? And what do? You've got to channel that energy out somewhere. You take it out on somebody else. And who do you take it out on? Somebody who can't stand up to you. And you're never going to choose a stronger person to go and pick that fight up with. And I think the other part is children who are used to a certain level of power entitlement at home itself, where there's a structure. If you are from a structure where X is the kind of power you wield at home, you're going to come out and expect that's going to be the same outside. And if you're going to do it on a bunch of people who are not used to that sort of power pressure, they'll succumb, right? Some of them will get up and fight, but that's going to happen. It's not very different from what's happened in the past with regard to, our feudal system and stuff like that. But it's just inherited structures that you have, or circumstances that have instilled those structures in you. So these are the two major ways that we see it going down.
One of the things I noticed is when you look for content out there about bullying, there's a lot of content on what one who's going through the bullying or the bullied has to go through, or how do you handle it. But there's hardly much content in a readable form. There's a lot of research, but in a readable form of how do you identify yourself as a bully?
Yeah.
What are some characteristics or traits?
So I think, like you rightly said, the frame of reference matters a lot, Saujanya. If this is seen as a way to get work done, the frame of reference is a positive one.
Give me an example here.
So we had a boy who was about 16 years old. He came from a family that dealt with granite, right? So a very well-off family, a huge joint family. And he came to us for two reasons. One of it was that he was socially very isolated, and the parents felt he was very depressed, and therefore he'd gained a lot of weight. So all of this kind of came together. They came to us because the child was pre-diabetic, to be honest, at this age. And one of the things that we kind of went through, and this is a very interesting conversation, I usually refer to it in multiple places, is that our initial intake is with the parents. And the father was pretty upfront. He was like, listen, the guy is bullshit at studies, he has no friends, he hangs out at home, he eats all day long, what is going to happen to him, right? And the mother was all about how, the boy is actually a very good boy at heart, and good, two solid perspectives that the parents see differently. At the end of it all, we said, and he'd been also asked to leave from 3 schools in the past 2 years. But jumping ahead, I sat down and I said, what do you want your child to be, right? You're evidently unhappy with the way this boy is turned out, so what do you want? So the father said, listen, I just want him to stick to a school, finish school, yeah. We've got a business to keep going, he's got to do his graduation, he's got to come here. Let's start moving on with life. What is this drama that's happening constantly, and get himself fit. So he had just 2 things, saying get your life in order and start studying and all that stuff, and please also manage your body weight. Mother went on to say that, he's always angry, he's always screaming at everybody, he doesn't have friends, he doesn't have a sense of humor. And she said, you're smart nahi hai. So I said, okay, what is smart? So essentially she wanted him to be fit, She wanted him to have a lot of friends, be popular. Also, be the sorts who's able to, other people gravitate towards, a role model sort of a thing. So finally I said, okay, that's a tall ask, but okay, we understand your expectations. Called the boy in and we said, what do you want? So your parents have spoken. He was simply not interested in hanging out with us. So I said, you tell me just one thing and you go away. What do you want? And he said, I just want one friend.
Oh.
And when we started working on the program with the family, we realized that everyone in the family is very rude to each other. They're certainly rude to this boy, and therefore he's rude back. He's rude at home, he's also rude in school, right? The whole going in position of pretty much doing anything in that family is you've got to get this work done, because they're perhaps a very execution-oriented family, because that's what the business maybe demands, are the demands of the business. So if he was being very rude and pushy, he was seen as a person who's able to get that job done, and he saw in his frame of reference that was not a bad thing, because he was told that that's a good skill to have, that hook or crook, you get the job done, right? And I think that's how it really starts. And I think behaviors that we kind of applaud as children, that we display to our children, that we say, yes, this is great behavior, you kind of got it done, is what the child will go on to judge themselves by.
I have one curious question here. One of the things I've noticed is when you get bullied, you go through that as a lonely experience.
Yeah.
Others see it, others observe it, but they don't have it's not my battle.
Yeah.
So I sort of step back and just watch it. Probably I'll talk about it in my house or among my closer circles on what my take is, or probably I'll just keep it to myself. But only when you go through it do you realize, oh shit, this is what the other person went through. Now, if you are in a team where you are seeing this passive-aggressive behavior, how can you stand up with the other person?
Yes. And I think in there, it becomes a very individual thing, Sajanya. It's no longer a team thing, because nobody wants to see a mob movement happening.
Yeah.
Right? It's got to be an individual thing. And I think this comes back to your very individual, I think it's a part of your personal integrity. No? And again, how many of us actually sit back and say, what is my sense of personal integrity?
Well, Devi, this was a fabulous conversation. I hope you liked it as much as I enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Sajanya. I was quite worried about, when you told me that you don't make questions and all of that, I was very worried. I was like, oh, good God, I don't, do well under a non-structured way. But I think this was incredible. It was fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.